Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 4th is one of those dates where history looks less like a straight line and more like a committee project, held together with panic, ego, and one guy insisting the gods are definitely on his side. Across centuries, you get emperors, reformers, conquerors, corporations, liberation movements, and pop stars, all showing up to prove that civilization is basically a long-running experiment in whether confidence can outrun consequences. So tonight, let's take a walk through the beautifully unhinged memory palace of April 4th, where politics becomes theater, theater becomes power, and power almost always ends with somebody pretending this was the plan all along. Segment 1, Empires Built on Panic, Pageantry, and Family Trauma. Ancient Rome knew how to handle a crisis the way many governments still do. When all else fails, import a new symbol, throw a festival, and hope the public mistakes spectacle for stability. During the Second Punic War, with Hannibal stomping around Italy like a five-alarm nightmare, Rome hauled in the goddess Cybele from Asia Minor and launched the Megalesia on April 4th, effectively saying, "We are still in control." Because nothing says control like state-sponsored mysticism and chariot races. It was classic Rome, a republic so practical it could legalize worship of a foreign savior while also side-eyeing her priests as too weird for citizenship. Then, a few centuries later, along comes Caracalla, born April 4th, a man who expanded Roman citizenship to millions in what sounds noble until you remember it also widened the tax net. That is Rome in one sentence. Congratulations, you are now empowered and billable. He built enormous baths, wore military fashion like an influencer with a sword, murdered his own brother, and turned imperial governance into a family reunion catered by paranoia. Rome could absorb foreign gods, new peoples, and vast territories, but it still couldn't solve the problem of ambitious sons with mommy issues and legions. Segment 2, Borders Drawn by Men Who Really Needed a Hobby. Medieval rulers were obsessed with maps, in the same way modern executives are obsessed with vision boards. Lots of arrows, lots of confidence, and not enough attention to the screaming. On the Indian subcontinent, the Battle of Narmada helped establish a real political boundary between North and South, when Harsha's expansion ran headfirst into Pulakeshin II, who basically told him, "This river is the line, and you are no longer a growth market." It is one of those moments where geography stops being scenery and becomes policy. Meanwhile, in Europe, Barcelona surrendered to Louis the Pious in 801 after a grinding siege, and Louis entered not like a barbarian looter, but like a man directing an aggressively religious halftime show, complete with clergy and psalms. Because when medieval empires conquered a city, they did not just want your taxes. They wanted your calendar, your church attendance, your worldview, and probably your local recipes. It was never enough to win the war. You had to narrate the win. Whether on the Narmada or in Barcelona, the message was the same. Borders are not just defended by armies. They are performed by the winners afterward, preferably with inscriptions, songs, and a very selective memory about how close the whole thing came to disaster. Segment 3, and the men who saved the state by making everything more complicated. If history teaches anything, it is that the people who rescue a collapsing system are often the exact people who make the sequel even messier. Alexios I Komnenos took the Byzantine throne in 1081, with the empire in free fall, and somehow turned collapse into recovery through a strategy historians might call deaf statecraft and the rest of us might call a family group chat with crowns. He filled the court with relatives, titles, and favors, which is either brilliant stabilization or the most sophisticated nepotism ring in medieval Europe. And then there's Alfonso X of Castile, who spent his life building law codes, astronomy tables, literary culture, and intellectual prestige, only to discover that writing rules does not stop your own son from treating succession like a hostile takeover. Alfonso wanted reason, legal principle, and cultural flourishing. His son, Sancho, wanted the throne. Now, please, with the support of every noble who heard the words tax reform and immediately reached for a sword. It is the eternal tension of state building. One man is trying to civilize power with books, codes, and institutions, while the other guy is out back rallying the cavalry with vibes. Alexios survived by making politics more intricate. Alfonso lost by assuming politics cared about fairness. History loves both types, mostly because both are excellent reminders that governing humans is a low-return investment in organized anxiety. Segment 4, and when national branding became the whole job. By the early modern era, power was no longer just about territory. It was about messaging, optics, and making your rivals watch you win. Francis Drake's knighting aboard the Golden Hind in 1581 was less a ceremony than an international troll with a throne attached. England looked at a man Spain considered a pirate and said, actually, that is Sir Pirate now. Queen Elizabeth turned maritime theft into national myth, converting stolen silver into patriotic branding, and proving the English state had figured out a very durable formula. If it embarrasses Spain and boosts the treasury, it counts as strategy. Centuries later, the United States did something spiritually similar with the World Trade Center dedication in 1973. Except instead of a galleon, it was 2 skyscrapers saying capitalism has entered the chat, and it is 110 stories tall. The irony, of course, is exquisite. The architect feared heights. Nixon skipped the ceremony because Watergate was boiling over. Even America's monuments arrive with side notes about insecurity. From Drake's battered ship to Manhattan's glass and steel chest thump, nations keep building giant props to tell themselves who they are. It is branding with cannons, branding with concrete, branding with enough patriotic confidence to distract from the fact that someone backstage is always frantically hiding the invoices. Segment 5, and democracy stumbles forward because the joke backfires. Not all April 4th history is imperial swagger. Sometimes progress happens because the people trying to humiliate someone accidentally invent the future. Susanna M. Salter became the first female mayor in the United States in 1887 because a bunch of local men thought putting her on the ballot without warning would embarrass women out of politics, which is such a perfect patriarchal misread. They assumed public life was too rough for women, then immediately demonstrated they themselves were unserious toddlers with access to election procedures. Salter found out the day of the vote, agreed to serve, and won by a landslide. Because nothing motivates a town quite like watching smug sexism step on a rake. A similar political turning point came with William Henry Harrison's death in 1841, though with considerably more sewage. His presidency lasted just 31 days, and what looked like a tragic medical episode became a constitutional stress test. John Tyler insisted he was not some substitute teacher president, but the full president, setting a precedent that kept the executive branch from turning into a legal improv class every time a chief executive died. So here you have 2 wildly different American lessons on April 4th. In one, a prank becomes democratic progress. In the other, contaminated water and terrible doctors force the country to define succession. Democracy, it turns out, is not always born in glory. Sometimes it emerges from a ballot ambush or a White House plumbing nightmare. Segment 6, and the day the modern world revealed its best songs and worst truths. The modern age on April 4th swings between liberation, invention, pop delirium, and moral catastrophe with the emotional stability of a radio constantly changing stations. In 1945, U.S. troops liberated Ohrdruf and forced the Western Allies to confront the Holocaust not as rumor or abstraction, but as physical, undeniable horror. It was the kind of truth so awful even hardened generals broke under it, which is why Eisenhower insisted the evidence be documented immediately. History had to be made undeniable. because denial was already waiting in the wings. Just 4 years later, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, turning wartime trauma into a permanent alliance, and essentially declaring that if Europe was going to keep producing apocalyptic crises, at least this time somebody would share the security deposit. Then, April 4th gives us Senegal's path to independence, Microsoft's founding in a scrappy apartment, the Beatles occupying the entire top 5 like cultural squatters with harmonies, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, which shattered the country and transformed a prophet of nonviolence into a martyr whose final speech sounded like he had already seen the ending. That is the unbearable range of modern history. Liberation camps, defense pacts, decolonization, software revolutions, pop ecstasy, and a murdered civil rights leader on a motel balcony. It is progress and grief sharing the same date, reminding us that modernity is not a clean upward climb. It is genius, violence, memory, and momentum all happening at once. In conclusion, April 4th does not offer a tidy lesson so much as a recurring warning label. States survive by adapting, but they also lie to themselves with ceremony. Reformers build systems that opportunists hijack. Empires draw borders. Artists redraw culture. And ordinary people occasionally turn someone else's bad faith stunt into a democratic breakthrough. And every once in a while, history rips away the pageantry entirely and shows us the stakes in their rawest form. That may be the real story of this date. Beneath every parade, coronation, treaty, hit single, or national myth is a deeper argument about who gets power, how they justify it, and what the rest of us are asked to believe. April 4th reminds us that history is never just what happened. It is what people built from panic, sold as destiny, survived despite cruelty, and remembered because forgetting would be far worse.